Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Děkuji moc krát. Budu mluvit anglicky. Je to v pořádku? Okay, budu mluvit anglicky. So the story about Jiří Dienstbier, one shouldn't overstate the story. I was not working with Mr. Dienstbier. I was an undergraduate whose job it was to get Mr. Dienstbier on time to meetings. And that challenge is the essence of the story. One of the things that I remember from that era of dealing with former dissidents who became politicians was that they really didn't like to wear ties. And I'm taking that as my own inspiration this evening. It's been a long and muggy day in New York, so I hope you'll indulge me. I've been asked to speak about my book On Tyranny, and it is very much the case that this is a book that I could not have written without Vaclav Havel. So it's a very special pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'm going to begin by telling you about the book, saying a word about where I was coming from when I wrote the book, trying to give you a sense of where I think we're going next, what could happen next, and I'll close with a word about Havel and Havel's political thought and how it seems to matter today. Now, it must matter today because this book, I'm not now boasting, or I'm boasting on behalf of Havel, this book has been a bestseller in New York Times for 28 weeks. It's been read by a couple of 100,000 people in this country, at least. It's cited here, there, and everywhere, which means that there is a continuity of that intellectual legacy of Havel into our own times. And it's an honor for me to be able to say so. It's an honor for me to be able to say that I've learned from this man. And therefore it's a special pleasure for me to be able to speak to you under these auspices. Okay, so what is On Tyranny? What is this little book? It is a political pamphlet. It is a guide to how things ought to be done. It's a political pamphlet which strives to be very much an American tradition. It is by far the most American thing I have ever done, or at least the most American thing I have done since I quit the Boy Scouts, which was some time ago. It begins with an invocation of the Constitution, which I mean very earnestly. It begins with an invocation of the Founding Fathers, which I also mean very earnestly. But I don't evoke them or invoke them as dead, stale tradition towards which we must nod. What I'm trying to elicit from them, what I'm trying to remind us all of, is that the Founding Fathers were very skeptical men. They were very skeptical about whether their own Constitution will work. If you read the Federalist Papers and their other correspondence, they are worried, and I think perfectly understandably, about how future generations of Americans will behave. They were not American exceptionalists, as some of us are. How could they be? There was no America yet. Their intellectual tradition was one of enlightenment, and therefore of skepticism. Their references, when they thought about democracy, this thing we take for granted, although we don't really have it, right? That's the funny thing about American democracy, we take it for granted, but we don't really have it. When they thought about democracy, their references were classical. They used classical terms, such as tyranny. So hence the book is called On Tyranny. Now, when they worried about democracy falling into tyranny, they had some excellent references they could draw on. They thought along with Thucydides and Aristotle about how inequality can lead democracies to fall into the hands of demagogues. They had some experiences or some literary historical references which are also familiar to us. We have one thing that they do not have, one thing alone, and that is 200 more years of historical experience. That's where the bulk of the book comes from, if one may say bulk with respect to a book which is so light. Right? That is where the bulk of the book comes from. What I try to do is start from their attitude of skepticism, and start from their method, which is to learn from the failures of the past, and point out to us all, I had in mind Americans, but to point out that democracies usually fail. And to point out that over the course of the 20th century, we've learned in what circumstances they fail. And to note that there were wise people who passed through those failures and have left behind for us a certain intellectual legacy from which we can draw. So the lessons of the book come from others. They don't come from me. All I do in this book is try to channel their wisdom. The book begins with the first lesson. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole book. But even if I did, it still wouldn't take more than an hour, so you'd be home on time and your kids wouldn't worry. But no, you can actually read the book during the lecture. It's short. You can read the whole thing while I lecture. People have done that, which is a choice I understand. I also like to read. So the first lesson of the book, lesson number 1, is do not obey in advance. I'm just very briefly going to read to you the text under the lesson. So number 1 is do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want, and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. Now, this is one of the things that historians agree about with respect to the 20th century. It's rarely the case that tyranny emerges dramatically, like a lightning bolt. Tyranny emerges generally through consent, statistically speaking, usually after elections. And then after elections, it requires the kind of consent that's given by looking away, doing nothing, slightly changing one's own opinions, adapting, or to use a very nice Czech word, normalizing the situation, right? That Czech word, normalizace, has great resonance, I think, in the United States today. So the first lesson is do not obey in advance. Number 2, defend institutions. Defend institutions. It is institutions that help us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. Do not speak of our institutions unless you make them yours by acting on their behalf. Institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. The third lesson, and you'll see how fundamentally these arise from basic experiences of the Czech and East European past. The third lesson is beware the one-party state. The parties that remade states and suppressed rivals were not omnipotent from the start. They exploited the historic moment to make political life impossible for their opponents. So support the multi-party system and defend the rules of democratic elections. Vote in local and state elections while you can. Consider running for office. So that's a sample of what the book is, of what On Tyranny is like. Where am I coming from? Why did I decide to write this book in November and December of 2016? In some sense, there's a short answer, there's a talk show answer, which is that Mr. Trump was elected president of the United States. But that moment, that shocking moment for me, and I think for many of us, happened against the background of 25 years of thinking about European history, of learning languages, as you were kind enough to mention, of reading sources, of writing about the Holocaust, but also about Stalinism. And from that particular perspective, which admittedly my fellow Americans find strange, but I think actually is rather useful, from that particular perspective, it's clear that that notorious the it can happen here. I take it for granted that it can happen here because the historical periods, moments that I work on, whether it's the 40s in Czechoslovakia or the 30s in Germany, are not so extraordinarily different from the life that I see around me. Or to put it a different way, it's certainly not self-evident to me that Americans in the 2010s are wiser politically than Czechoslovaks in the 1940s or Germans in the 1930s. Right? I would not want to take that for granted. So it can happen here. Teachers. In order to become that historian who I became, I had to have teachers. And my teachers, as it happened, were people who lived through communism, which is something, of course, I knew. As I became their friend, as I learned more from them, it emerged that a number of my teachers were also people that we would call in America Holocaust survivors, that is, people who were Jewish or of Jewish origin, who had survived in one unlikely way or another the Second World War in Warsaw or somewhere else in Eastern Europe. Now, the reason that's so important, at least important for someone trying to communicate a European experience back to Americans at a critical time, is that it shows that it not only can happen, it can happen to people like us. Because my teachers have to be people like me, they taught me. And then if I can communicate to Americans, that means it's all people like us. I'm sure this is a simple point for you, but it's important for America. The third place I'm coming from are my students and their experiences. I'm not nearly as old as I seem. I play the dignified professor as much as I can, up to the point where I make jokes about it. But I'm old enough to have had a whole generation of students. I'm old enough to have had meaningful connections with people who come from Eastern Europe, who were born between 1990, let's say, and even 2000. People who, whether they're from Russia or Hungary or Poland, whose lifetime does not at all correspond to that promise that was made after 1989, namely that democracy was coming, liberalism was coming, freedom was coming, prosperity was coming. If you were born around the year 1989, or a bit later, and you live in a number of East European countries, that's simply not what has happened. And many of these younger people are the ones who I have seen struggle, not intellectually, but politically. I've seen my students protest, and I've seen my students beaten, and I've seen my students tortured, and in some cases I've seen my students killed. And from them also, as from the generations who are older than me, I have tried to learn. And of course the basic thing that I learned from them is, it's happening now. It's not just that it can happen, or it can happen to people like us. It's happening now. The it that is happening in the United States is part of a larger it that is also happening in Russia or Ukraine or Hungary or Poland or the Czech Republic or a number of other countries. The tendencies that one sees or feels in the United States are part of a much larger story. So this brings us to the next few lessons in the book, which I hope you'll be patient with me as I read. Number 4, take responsibility for the face of the world. The symbols of today enable the reality of tomorrow. Notice the swastikas and the other signs of hate. Do not look away and do not get used to them. Remove them yourself and act as an example for others to do so. Number 5, remember professional ethics. When political leaders set a negative example, professional commitments to just practice become more important. It is hard to subvert the rule of law without lawyers, or to hold show trials without judges. Authoritarians need obedient civil servants, and concentration camp directors need businessmen interested in cheap labor. Lesson 6, be wary of paramilitaries. When the men with guns, who have always claimed to be against the system, start wearing uniforms and marching with torches and pictures of a leader, the end is nigh. When the pro-leader paramilitaries and the official police and military intermingle, the end has come. Lesson 7, be reflective if you must be armed. If you carry a weapon in public service, may God bless you and keep you. But know that evils of the past involved policemen and soldiers finding themselves one day doing irregular things. Be ready to say no. What do I think is going on? As I listened to those lessons, and I was listening to them too, I wrote them back in December, and it's not as though I read them out loud to myself every day when I brush my teeth. As I listened to those lectures, I was struck, and perhaps you were as well, that they don't refer to things that happened in 2016. They refer to things that happened since 2016. They refer to events which had not yet happened when I wrote those lines. Charlottesville had not yet happened when I wrote those lines in December, which suggests, I hope, that history is useful as a guide to the present, right? Everything that's in this book is in this book, not because I knew what Mr. Trump was going to do from telepathy or whatever the psychic gift is called. What's it called when you can see the future? There's a word for it.
Clairvoyance.
Clairvoyance? No. Okay, I'm going to wait for the American Parapsychological Association to come and give me the correct word. Sorry?
Prophetic.
Yeah, prophecy is nice. Prophecy is nice. So it didn't come from the gift of prophecy. It came from seeing certain historical patterns. So where do I think we're going? What do I think is going on? What do I see as a historian? So let me take a step back and say a word about what I think is happening with time. So I think that what Americans and to some extent Europeans have been living through for the past 20 years is what I would call the politics of inevitability, the conviction that history is over, that there really were no alternatives, that everything that seems to be going wrong is in some sense just a blip and will somehow sort itself out as we move towards a future that we know. I think that's the basic mistake that Americans made with 1989. It's not a mistake that the dissidents were making, but it's a mistake that we certainly made. We decided that since the communist story was over, our story was right, which I think is exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. I think the right conclusion would have been something like, all of these stories are wrong. All of these stories are wrong. The communist story is wrong, but the capitalist story is also wrong. Because let's face it, people, the idea that the market, that nature is the market and the market brings democracy, it's a pretty sad description of the way the world actually works, and it always has been. It's pretty thin. Its predictive capacity is awful. It's the kind of thing you can only really believe once you've convinced yourself that there are no alternatives, because the moment you start to think of alternatives, they start rushing in for good or bad. And some of them are bad. So I think what's happened, a lot of what's happened, is that the politics of inevitability has given way to something which I would call the politics of eternity. That is, the idea that history doesn't move forward in a straight line to the future, but instead, history is just cycles. The same bad things happen over and over again. The virtuous Czech nation or the virtuous American nation or the virtuous American white people are constantly under threat over and over again by the same people, the same threats. And because history is like that, because time is like that, because threat is constant, we can't change things for the better. And I think a lot of what happened suddenly to Americans in 2016 is that many people shifted from one to the other. I will tell this as a joke, but it's not, it happened, okay? So I was talking about this book at Harvard, and this could be at Yale. It just so happens that it was at Harvard. I'm not making fun of Harvard. This didn't have to be Harvard, but it was Harvard. So I was lecturing about this book in a hall much like this one, and there were some undergraduates there, so I was kind of going back and forth with them. And I said, so look, with you guys, in October, you were saying everything is going great, and therefore I'm going to go work in finance. And then in December, you said to yourselves, well, everything's going to hell, so I'll just go work in finance. And they all nodded and they sort of laughed, right? That, in a nutshell, is where we are. Many of us who thought that everything was kind of going on the right track suddenly think, well, we can't really do anything about it anyway. And then, of course, there are other people, not the kind of people who are at Harvard, not the kind of people who are going to work in finance, who over the course of the last 20 years in the United States have basically been the subjects of an experiment in inequality. Levels of economic inequality in this country are now reaching and indeed passing levels of inequality that we had before the Great Depression. And that has political consequences. It makes it very hard for people to believe that the future is going to be a better version of the present. It makes it easier for people to believe that history is just a cycle and the same threat is always just around the corner. It makes it much more likely that people will believe a politician promises not a future, but to make America great again. So in some very broad sense, I think this is what's happening. And in a very specific sense, this helps us to understand why Russia is so important, which is not something which is self-evident. Now, I believe that the Russian intervention in the American elections was decisive. That is to say, I think without Russian help, Mr. Trump would have lost. And it's a subject about which I wrote a great deal. I was actually the first person to write about the subject. I broke the story way back in April of 2016, and I followed it with a great deal of interest since then. So I would be the last person to doubt the influence of Russia in our political process. I think we are, to put it very bluntly, I think we are now a half-sovereign country, which has lost the first major cyber war in history, and this is what it feels like. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Mr. Trump was a failed businessman who was bailed out by the Russian mob. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Mr. Trump's first foreign policy speech was written by somebody in the employment of a Russian gas company. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Mr. Trump's advisor for Russian affairs, Carter Page, was in the employment of a Russian gas company. And a little footnote on him, he was Mr. Trump's advisor until Russia said he wasn't anymore, and then he stopped being his advisor. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Michael Flynn had been paid by a Russian propaganda outlet before he became Mr. Trump's advisor on national security affairs. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner actually met with Russians, colluded with the Russians just before Russia released Hillary Clinton's emails. I would be the last person who would want to forget that Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, perjured himself in his own confirmation hearings by lying about his contacts with Russia, and so on and so forth. This happened. It happened, and it happened the way it happened, and we have lessons to learn from it. But a deeper question is, how could it happen? Why were all of those negative ads about Hillary Clinton that Russia posted on Facebook so effective, right? It's one thing to know that they did it. Okay, they did it. They threw the election, they broke the law. But why did it work? It's very hard to understand why it worked without noticing that something has gone very wrong in the United States. People were receptive to those messages, whether they came from abroad or not, for a reason, which was that it was very hard for a lot of Americans to believe that things were just going better, that things were just automatically going better. So my answer to all of this is history, not just in general, but the specific history that I try to present in this little book. I don't believe in the politics of inevitability. I never have. In this sense, I'm very much, I think, in the spirit of Václav Havel's writing in the 1970s. I don't believe in either version of the modern story, the capitalist one or the communist one. I don't believe that there are any mechanisms where nature leads to something, leads to something, leads to something. At the end, everything turns out very well. But I also don't believe in the politics of eternity. I don't believe that we're trapped in cycles, as Mr. Bannon does. I don't believe that, well, reform is always impossible because the enemy is always at the gate. I believe that history is about structures, but that it's also about freedom. That knowing about history teaches us the constraints in which we live, but also gives us a sense of what we can do. And the essence of the book is, we actually have a lot more power right now than we think we do. If I were to draw this, and it's good that there's no chalkboard back here or whiteboard, because I always yield to the temptation and walk away from the microphone and the lights and start drawing charts, which no one can read anyway. But if I were drawing this, I would draw it like this. I would say, in normal democratic conditions, your influence as a citizen is like this. Then when the regime starts to change, which is now, when the regime starts to change, for a moment your influence goes way up, because you're actually influencing whether or not the system will change. And this lasts for maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months. And then your influence goes way back down. If there is an authoritarian consolidation, then your influence actually goes way, way, way down. And the mistake that people make is that they waste this. Right here they say, mañana. They say, I'm going to wait for my friends. I'm going to wait for my leaders. The institutions are going to protect me. It's not happening here. It can't happen here. And you say that for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, and it's over. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to use history to help us get out ahead of time, to use history to convey some of the lessons that actually help us to make a difference in the present. The next one of these is an important one to me. Number 8 is stand out. 8, stand out. Someone has to. It is easy to follow along. It can feel strange to do or say something different. But without that unease, there is no freedom. Remember Rosa Parks. The moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken, and others will follow. Number 9, be kind to our language. Avoid pronouncing the phrases everyone else does. Think up your own way of speaking, even if only to convey that thing you think everyone is saying. Make an effort to separate yourself from the internet. Read books. Number 10, believe in truth. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. Number 11, investigate. Figure things out for yourself. Spend more time with long articles. Subsidize investigative journalism by subscribing to print media. Realize that some of what is on the internet is there to harm you. Learn about sites that investigate propaganda campaigns, some of which come from abroad. Take responsibility for what you communicate with others. Number 12, make eye contact and small talk. This is not just polite, it is part of being a citizen and a responsible member of society. It is also a way to stay in touch with your surroundings, break down social barriers, and understand whom you should and should not trust. If we enter a culture of denunciation, you will want to know the psychological landscape of your own daily life. Number 13, practice corporeal politics. Power wants your body softening in your chair and your emotions dissipating on the screen. Get outside. Put your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people. Make new friends and march with them. Number 14, establish a private life. Nastier rulers will use what they know about you to push you around. Scrub your computer of malware on a regular basis. Remember that email is skywriting. Consider using alternative forms of the internet or simply using it less. Have personal exchanges in person. For the same reason, resolve any legal trouble. Tyrants seek the hook on which to hang you. Try not to have too many hooks. Where do I think we are going? What do I think is likely to happen next? One thing which is clear, and I hope has been clear for a long time, is that it's not going to be more of the same. Something dramatic happened in November of 2016 in the United States of America. We're not going to have more of the status quo. The changes that have taken place are already rather dramatic. We're well over the line of it can't happen here territory. And if you don't believe me, go back and read what people were saying in 2015 about Mr. Trump. The things that can't happen, many of them have already happened. And if you don't think so, that means that you just learn to take them for granted, right? Which means that we're all in even deeper trouble. So where do I think we go from here? What do I think is happening? What do I think the dangers are? I think the most likely outcome, the one that reminds me most of Ukraine and Russia, is oligarchy. Oh, oligarchy, what's oligarchy? Those in Thucydides, I'm obsessed with Thucydides. Why? Because Thucydides was the first historian. And what's really cool about Thucydides is, we think the Peloponnesian Wars are ancient history because they were 2,000 years ago. But to Thucydides, they were not ancient history. They were happening while he was alive. And so the very first history book that we have is actually about things that were seen by the first historian, which, see that makes me feel okay about talking about the history of the present, right? Because I couldn't have a more ancient and legitimate justification. So oligarchy means rule by the few. 100 years after Thucydides, Aristotle comes along and defines oligarchy as rule by the wealthy few. And in that sense, the word appears again 2,000 odd years later in Russian, rule by the wealthy few. And in that sense, it then now appears in English, for very good reason. So what I think we're headed towards is oligarchy with just as much fascism as is necessary. That is, I don't think we have fascism in the sense of rulers, whether it's in Moscow or Washington, who actually want us rallying on the streets, at least not yet. What we have is something which wants to confuse us and persuade us that there's really nothing that we can do, that we should really just spend more time on the couch and just let it happen. Because remember, there's nothing we can do. History goes in cycles. There are threats from the outside. we're just a virtuous national community waiting for terrorism, right? There's nothing we can really do except wait for that and then do what our leaders say. That's something like that. And let's just let wealth inequality increase and get worse, because what can we really do about that? That's just the way things are. There are a lot of signs that this is what is happening, right? The way Mr. Trump campaigned was very unusual. His habit of referring to the people, this is right out of both communism and fascism, referring to the people and meaning some people, but not the others, the enemies. When Mr. Trump referred to, he's actually done it multiple times, referred to journalists as enemies of the people, that is a citation of Joseph Stalin, but not only of Stalin, of a number of other Stalinist leaders, including Czechoslovak ones, as you will know very well. The idea that journalists are literally enemies of the people. There are other more obscure things which set my mind in motion. Things that, that historians will notice, like when Mr. Trump demands a loyalty oath from Mr. Comey. What's wrong with loyalty, right? I mentioned that I was a Boy Scout. I'm pretty sure that that was one of the virtues that we recited. What's wrong with loyalty? Here's what's wrong with loyalty. Loyalty is a way in politics of circumventing the rule of law, right? So if the President of the United States asks the Director of the FBI for personal loyalty, what he is saying is the laws don't apply to you and me, right? Mr. Trump later said to Mr. Comey after that conversation, you and I have that thing, and I'm making this gesture because that is the gesture that he made, right? You and I have that thing. And that thing is, I know that you know, and you know that I know, that the law doesn't really apply. That's a big step. And of course, for any historian, what a loyalty oath recalls is Nazi Germany in 1934. Because the way that Hitler becomes the Führer is by way of a loyalty oath. He's no longer prime minister, but he's the leader at the moment when people have to swear loyalty to him personally, to his person, not to the institutions. It maybe seems subtle, but it's a huge difference, right? And that's the kind of thing Mr. Trump thinks is normal. Speaking of the rule of law, deliberately choosing to pardon, which is a kind of extra legal capacity already, deliberately choosing to pardon someone whose offense was his own scorn for the law, right? When Sheriff Arpaio is pardoned, that's someone who is saying, I don't accept the rule of law. And then Mr. Trump is using the pardon to endorse that. So, and the rule of law is, of course, the fundament of everything. The rule of law is what we're hanging on to by the skin of our teeth, right? What we were expecting, what we were hoping for, is that the FBI will watch the generals, and the generals will watch the oligarchs, and the oligarchs will watch Mr. Trump. That's the good version, right? That's the good version. That's the checks and balances that we seem to have right now. I checked, and those are not the checks and balances in the first couple articles of the Constitution. And it's certainly not what democracy looks like, right? The democracy doesn't say, we count on the police to check the army, we count on the army to check the wealthy, we count on the wealthy to check the president. But that's pretty much where we are. Okay, which brings me to the last few lessons, and then we'll wrap it up. Number 15 is contribute to good causes. Be active in organizations, political or not, that express your own view of life. Pick a charity or two instead of autopay. Then you'll have made a free choice that supports civil society and helps others to do good. Number 16, learn from peers in other countries. Keep up your friendships abroad, or make new friends in other countries. The present difficulties in the United States are an element of a larger trend, and no country is going to find a solution by itself. Make sure you and your family have passports. Number 17. Now the passports are important, and it's not just for escape. So, and no, I mean, of course, the passports come to me. They come to me from the history of the Holocaust, where in my book Black Earth, one of the things I try to get across is that the deprivation of citizenship was part of the process of mass killing. Hannah Arendt called it the killing of the juridical person. The juridical person is killed before the biological person is killed. In order for the Holocaust to take place, people had to be deprived of citizenship. States had to be destroyed. The destruction of the Czechoslovak state although it's rarely mentioned as such, is an important part of the history of the Holocaust. That's why I talk about passports. And the other reason I talk about passports is that I know lots of people who are involved in opposition or in dissidence in countries where that is much more risky than the United States. And they all have passports. They all have passports, and they don't have passports just because they want to escape. They have passports because if you actually live that life, sometimes you need a break. These are not things Americans think of. We're not used to having to think in this way. But if you're looking at a struggle which lasts for months or years, you want a passport because at some point you're going to want to go to Toronto and take a little break, or you're going to want to go to Ukraine and talk to some oppositionists there to learn from them. So that's passports. Number 17, listen for dangerous words. Be alert to the words extremism and terrorism. Be alive to the fatal notions of emergency and exception. Be angry about the treacherous use of patriotic vocabulary. Number 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. Modern tyranny is terror management. When the terrorist attack comes, remember that authoritarians exploit such events in order to consolidate power. The sudden disaster that requires the end of checks and balances, the dissolution of opposition parties, the suspension of freedom of expression, the right to a fair trial, and so on, is the oldest trick in the Hitlerian book. Do not fall for it. Number 19, be a patriot. Set a good example of what America means for the generations to come. They will need it. Number 20, be as courageous as you can. If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny. What does this have to do with Havel? I'm sure as many of you have been listening, you've heard the echoes of arguments that Vaclav Havel and other Czechoslovak thinkers of the 1970s and 1980s have made. I have to say, I find myself more and more grateful that that was the time when I was growing up, and these were the people who I was reading, that I had a chance to overlap in life with Václav Havel and with Adam Michnik. And it's of course sad that what they had to say in the 1970s comes back around and is so significant now, but it's crucial that it's there. I think of this as a kind of generosity. All the people that I'm citing, whether it's the German Jews or the dissidents, they didn't have to write as well and as long as they did. And it was only in 2016 that it occurred to me, they weren't doing it for themselves. They weren't even really doing it for their countries or their moments. They were doing it for us. Hannah Arendt was writing for us, Victor Klemperer was writing for us. Havel in 1977, when he wrote The Power of the Powerless, was he really doing that for Czechoslovaks then? Because no Czechoslovak actually read it then, right? It was circulated in a few dozen, nobody read it in 1977 or 78. He wasn't, but the point is he wasn't really writing it just for the Czechoslovaks who were in it. He was writing it for the ages. He was writing it for us. And so we have it. So how does Havel matter? The first way, obviously, is that my whole claim here is that our individual actions matter, not just morally, but politically. Or our individual moral actions, our individual moral choices, even the ones that seem small, have political consequences. And if Havel could make this case in the 1970s in Czechoslovakia, I think it's a case that we can safely make in America in 2017. Havel writes, in The Power of the Powerless, he writes, "The most interesting thing about responsibility is that we carry it with us everywhere. That means that responsibility is ours, that we must accept it and grasp it here, now, in this time and space where the Lord has set us down." A second way that Havel matters, of course, in this book, from what I believe, is his attention to signs, his attention to symbols. Lesson number 4 about taking care of the face of the world comes straight from Havel. In fact, I quote Havel in it, the famous parable of the greengrocer, which I will read a bit to you. Havel writes, you know the story. The greengrocer, he has a sign in his window. The window says, "Workers of the world unite." And Havel asks, why does he have that sign there? It's not that he believes that the workers of the world should unite. It's the 1970s. Nobody believes that anymore. It's not about truth. It's not about conviction. Why does he have that sign there? And what does it matter politically? And this is what Havel says. We have seen that the real meaning of the greengrocer's slogan has nothing to do with what the text of the slogan actually says. Even so, the real meaning is quite clear and generally comprehensible because the code is so familiar. The greengrocer declares his loyalty in the only way the regime is capable of hearing. That is, by accepting the prescribed ritual, by accepting appearances as reality, by accepting the given rules of the game, thus making it possible for the game to go on, for it to exist in the first place. And of course, my attention to, or my obsession with factuality and truth is something which comes from Havel and the other dissidents of the 1970s, people who inhabited failed ideological worlds where ideology is still capable of suppressing everyday human experience. A world that's different than ours, but which has certain similarities. It is unfashionable to care about factuality, right? That's one thing which the American left has gotten very wrong, to its great, I think, to everyone's detriment. And now we live in a world where the news has been replaced by the media, where reportage has been replaced by impressions. In that sense, we are a bit like the communist world of the 1970s. We have to scratch and claw our way towards factuality if we want to have some kind of a chance. Or, as Havel put it, we're not here yet, but we're getting there. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living in truth. And if that sounds dramatic, if living in truth sounds too dramatic or too biblical, consider this. Every single thing that we know about the Trump administration comes from an investigative journalist. Everything. If this administration had happened in some future 5 years or 10 years from now, with no Washington Post, no New York Times, no investigative reporters for The Guardian or BuzzFeed or what have you, we would know nothing. We would have a vague sense that things were off. We would argue with ourselves a lot, but we would know nothing. Everything that I said earlier about Russia, we know thanks to reporters. Some of them, of course, Russian, but everything we know thanks to a handful of people who do the very elementary, boring job of traveling and talking and trying to ascertain facts. So the truth is of fundamental political importance. Of course, that's something that comes from Havel. Finally, humility or learning from others. Those of you who remember The Power of the Powerless, this essay that I keep citing, will remember that Havel always keeps saying, Patočka said, right? Patočka said, Patočka said. He's citing his friend, his teacher, Jan Patočka, a great, very eminent phenomenologist philosopher who died as a result of an interrogation in communist Czechoslovakia. But Havel is not saying, I thought this up myself. He's saying, Patočka says, someone else says. And even the essay itself only arose because Czech and Polish dissidents met at the border, and people wanted Havel to write down some of these thoughts that he had, so he did. So the point is that that humility matters, or learning from others matters, but I also mean humility in a different sense. This is for Americans. This whole business of how we won the Cold War has not been helpful for us. This whole business about how communism failed and therefore capitalism is right, that hasn't helped us very much. I mean, I like markets. I think markets have their purpose, right? But the whole idea that that they had it wrong, and therefore we have it right, no matter what, right? That has not been helpful. There's been a whole lot of learning from experience in the last 20 years that hasn't happened, or to put it a different way, because we said that history was over, we put ourselves on an accelerated crash course of forgetting. And forgetting is the most dangerous thing that one can do. And if you've forgotten, you know what it means to forget? What it means to forget is that you can't learn from yourself. That's what forgetting means. It means you have to learn from others, which is, I think, a useful thing for Americans to be reminded of. Finally, what I get from Havel in this book is a sense of what history actually is. When I talked earlier about the politics of inevitability, the politics of eternity, maybe that sounded a little abstract, but what I was trying to get at was the way that we can feel like we're thinking about past and future in ways where we have no responsibility. So if you accept the politics of inevitability, that, you know, in the capitalist version, nature means markets and markets means democracy, everything honky-dory. If you accept something like that, you don't have any responsibility to nature or to markets or democracy because everything is just going to work out. Or if you accept the politics of eternity, that we were a virtuous nation at the center of history, we've never done anything wrong, but there are just these threats that come around over and over and over again. Again, no responsibility. And these are ways of thinking about time which actually abolish the present. They abolish the present in the sense that there's never a moment where we actually have to take responsibility. And that, of course, was Havel's obsession. His obsession precisely was with responsibility. And history, that is, trying to figure out what structure you're in so that you can see how you yourself can change it, is synonymous with responsibility. Because the moment that you see how you can change it, it's your choice to do so or not to do so. Thank you very much.